Okay, so I think we'll start 2 minutes early because everyone seems ready and raring to go. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Coalition for Global Prosperity panel. And I think the only panel at this entire conference that is exclusively covering the war in Ukraine. I'm Tom Nurkham. I'm a senior researcher at CGP. CGP exists to support a strong and comprehensive British foreign policy that brings stability globally and boosts security and prosperity here in Britain in the most turbulent of times. This panel is going to be looking at the lessons that the UK can learn from the war in Ukraine, from the use of new technologies in warfare, the increasing alignment between Russia and its autocratic partners, the abhorrent war crimes that have been such a feature of this war, and the increased use of sub-threshold or grey zone warfare against Ukraine and NATO members. Joining me is a very strong panel that is able to cover all of these things and more. So I'll start on my far right, Sir John Whittingdale, OBE MP, who is the Member of Parliament for Malden and is a member of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. Sir John has held a variety of positions in government, including Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and several ministerial roles within DCMS and DSET. He is also the Vice Chair of the APPG on Ukraine. On my immediate right, we have Aliona Halivko, who is the founder and CEO of St James's Foreign Policy Group and a member of CGP's Advisory Council. Aliona has had an extensive career in Ukrainian politics, including a period serving as an advisor to the former Ukrainian Prime Minister. She has written for and appeared on the BBC, Sky News, Telegraph, Foreign Policy, and some others as well. On my immediate left, we have Lincoln Jopp, MC/MP, who is the Member of Parliament for Spelthorne since the election last year. Lincoln is a member of the Defence Select Committee and is PPS to the Shadow Foreign Secretary. Before entering Parliament, he had a long and distinguished career in the British military, serving in Northern Ireland, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Sierra Leone, where he was awarded the Military Cross. And finally, we have Megan Gittos, who is the Director of Communications and Policy at the Henry Jackson Society and is an Associate Research Fellow at GlobeSec. Prior to joining the HJS, she was an advisor to Tobias Ellwood when he was Chair of the Defence Select Committee and helped to scrutinise MOD, Foreign Office and the government's broader security strategy. So the way that this panel is going to work is that I will ask some opening questions to our panelists and a couple of follow-ups as well before handing over to all of you for some questions as well. So be primed and ready. Start thinking now. Lincoln, I'll start with you. General Mark Milley, who was the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said a couple of years ago that the war in Ukraine is part 1914, part 1940s, and part 2022. You know, the use of trenches, tanks in Kursk, and also drones and cyber and various new technologies that are coming into warfare. What's your assessment of the nature of modern warfare from what we have seen in Ukraine? And what kind of things does the Ministry of Defence here need to learn from what we've seen in Ukraine?
Thanks, Tom. And thanks to everyone for coming. And I'm not arrogant enough to think that it's anything other than the fact that you've got free sandwiches. So congratulations for coming to the right gig. As well as Tom's very kind introduction, I don't claim any special insight. I have been to Ukraine, but I've never fought there. I was shot and blown up in a single day, which doesn't mean I know anything. It just means that my knees don't work and my hearing's not that great. But the General Miley, I think, made a very interesting observation, because the war in Ukraine is very different to everything that we have seen hitherto, and yet it's the same in certain aspects. And this was slightly brought home to us on the Defence Select Committee when we received a letter in November last year from one of the people who were being trained by the Brits. And if you think about how long we've been doing that, it was quite telling. He said, "We're terribly grateful and all that, but I'm afraid you're increasingly out of date because you can't replicate the drone warfare that is downrange. And similarly, we really need to build a Soviet-style trench system, and environmental constraints mean that we can't do that on Salisbury Plain. And so, having been, in the van of putting our hand up to help in the Ukraine war, and that's, I think, one of the first lessons that Britain found its voice and its leadership as a sovereign state for probably the first time since Brexit. And I think I encourage that a great deal more. But things move very fast, and as you all know, conflict is a dialectic. It's a move and counter move. The second one I'd probably put my finger on, of course, is that it didn't start with the invasion. It started much earlier than that, in 2014. And so Mark Carlton-Smith, a mate of mine who was the former chief of the General Staff, he was over there making videos about little green men and grey zone operations long before this current operation. I would probably highlight, and we'll probably come to, coalition management. There's been a theme from day one, and coalition control of the Ukrainian military. And we'll get on to Flamingo, and we'll get on to one or two other things, but that's probably it for now.
I just want to build on this idea of being increasingly out of date. Aliona, there have been accusations that the West, whilst giving money and supplies to Ukraine, has not nearly given enough, not done so at the scale that is needed. It's been fighting with one hand tied behind its back. But we've also had senior Ukrainian politicians who have been saying that the provision of Storm Shadow, Challenger tanks and so forth have really given Ukraine an edge over Russia. How have you seen, the speed and scale of Western support to Ukraine? What's gone well? What's not gone well? And also, what does the UK need to be doing over the coming months and years to really put Ukraine in the best position going forward?
Gosh, those are all very good questions. Thank you, Tom, and thank you to CGP for indeed holding the only event on Ukraine. I think even 1 or 2 years ago, this would be unthinkable, that Ukraine would get so little attention, and yet it's not only my home country, effectively, that's under attack. It's the full-scale war in Europe. And the rest of Europe is taking this war very seriously, having just come back from the Warsaw Security Forum, with Poland experiencing its first drone incursions and having very little support from the United States, for example, but also France being a partnering nation, and Norway and Germany are all still taking this war very, very seriously. So I think if I start with your last questions, we still need to be taking this way more seriously than we are, and certainly not giving in to the whole war fatigue narrative, because it's nothing more than an element of cognitive warfare that Russia is successfully waging in all of our Western societies. But let me start from the very beginning. The UK indeed was #1 supporter of Ukraine. It started very strong from 2014, when most of European countries did not recognize the war as it was, when it was still considered to be an uprising in the east of Ukraine and separatist movements. But the UK was very steadfast in opening the orbital training for Ukraine that later on transformed into Interflex, that trained about 50,000 soldiers from Ukraine. And it was very, very useful at the start. And I can testify from my brother, who underwent training here as well last year, in the north of the country. Probably will refrain from saying where exactly. But he, having been on the front line then for 2 years already, and being a commander of a reconnaissance unit, he did say that it was quite outdated what he was being taught, but nonetheless, it put more of a structure and shaped his experience, and he was also able to give back and explain more of how specifically drone warfare, but also the trench warfare is evolving in Ukraine, because it is evolving very quickly. And while we're focused on modern technology like drones and defense AI, that's rapidly accelerating in Ukraine, electronic warfare is a very strong element of this war too, where Russia unfortunately is winning. And this may sound way too negative, but I've also just come back from Ukraine last night, where I spent 2 days with my brother who was on leave from war back home, and he was effectively saying to me that Ukraine is now losing the drone warfare to Russia, that Russia has outpaced in everything that they can supply to the front line in the development of drones in terms of speed and their quality, in terms of the resources that they have and how much of that technology they have, not to mention artillery, ammunition, and the vast number of people that they have in their ranks, where one Ukrainian brigade could go up against a whole division of Russians. And they are still queuing in military mobilization units in Russia, volunteering to go to fight because the salaries are so high that their families would never otherwise see that kind of level of salaries at any point. So that's a bit of a gloomy note, but a realistic one for all of us to consider, because as I've mentioned, through training, through the provision of tanks, which are maybe not as essential on the battlefield, because it was very hard to reconcile them with all the other tanks that Ukraine got. And one of the defense officials at the early days of war in 2022 described to me the Ukrainian battlefield as the zoo, just because of all the number of equipments that they had, very different, with different ammunitions. As we know, the German Leopard tanks were best adjusted to Ukrainian battlefield, have different kind of barrels and ammunitions to the British Challengers, not to mention American Abrams, and that's just tanks. And then we go into fighter jets areas and the air defenses, which take time to train Ukrainian soldiers to operate. But the crucial and essential thing right now, Storm Shadows as cruise missiles have been very, very important to keep Ukrainian skies safe. So for Ukraine, the number one factor would be to get more of those. Yeah. But of course, as the war risk increases, the UK tends to keep them more to itself, just to be ready to protect the country if necessary. But I would still urge to send as much air defense into the war zone as possible. More ammunition, of course, is essential. But what's most importantly is defense tech. And I think we can go more into this on how Ukraine can share its experience with the UK, while so many companies and initiatives here could also contribute in entering joint ventures and co-production with Ukrainian companies to be able to get ready for the future warfare. I think I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Ariana, for very stark but very important comments, which I'm sure everyone will leave here thinking about in greater detail. John, I'm sure you'll want to mention the reception you're holding afterwards, but let me just ask a quick question before you do that. One of the main reasons that Russia has been able to continue this war is because it's being propped up by autocratic partners. You know, Iran's provided drones and missiles, North Korea has been providing men, and China has been effectively propping up the entire Russian economy and war effort. Could you perhaps talk us through how these four states are aligning in global politics? Is it an alliance? And given how much they have been propping up the Russian war effort, would it be reasonable for the UK and other NATO allies to start, imposing sort of punishments and consequences for those who have been supporting the Russian war effort?
I don't think it's an entirely new phenomenon. I mean, you can go back to Reagan's time and the designation of the axis of evil, and the countries that you've mentioned. They paraded in Moscow for the Victory Day celebrations, and there has always been a recognition amongst those that they share a opposition to democracy and the West, and that they represent an authoritarian dictatorship that is now working closely together, and we need to take account of that. Now, I don't think that there is an immediate military threat to this country from China or from North Korea or from Iran. There is from Russia. But the fact that in Ukraine, we are seeing all of those other countries. Iranian missiles have been fired by Russia onto Ukrainian cities. We've seen, obviously, North Korean troops, and only very recently we've seen reports that China is making available satellite information to Russia. So all three of those other countries are active in supporting Russia. And we do need to reconsider how we deal with that. Lincoln referred to the fact that the war started in 2014. I mean, in some ways it started earlier than that. I became chair of the Ukraine All-Party Parliamentary Group in 2010. That was under Yanukovych. But in 2008, you will recall, we had the Russian invasion of Georgia, and the West was feeble. That then led, shortly after the Maidan in 2014, to the Russian taking of Crimea, and the West's reaction was doubly feeble. And after that, I mean, I remember visiting Mariupol and Berdyansk at the time of Operation Orbital, and was told very plainly by the Ukrainian commanders it was a matter of time. They recognized that Russia was going to attack, and we did what we could to try and prepare the Ukrainian military, but it was always on the cards. And we have to learn the lessons from that, because the war that is now taking place, it is Ukraine that is suffering militarily, but actually all of the Western nations are now under attack in different ways. Lincoln talks about grey zone, but we've seen, obviously, incursions into our airspace. We've seen bombings and targeted assassinations. We've seen cyber attack. We've seen sabotage. All of that is ongoing. And the fact that even now, when there is clear testing by Russia through things like incursion into airspace, and we have had two, I think, Article 4 meetings of NATO, but it actually hasn't produced anything at all yet. And unless we make it plain that we will not tolerate this and give every support to Ukraine, then Putin will go on. So, I think that as part of our response, and I'm sure we'll come on to talk about sanctions and about defence expenditure and munition supply, but we do need to think about. We've had a China audit, and on the Foreign Affairs Committee we've been thinking about this, but the government is completely schizophrenic. On the one hand, we are told by our security services that China represents the biggest threat, and that there is active Chinese espionage going on, but at the same time we're sending trade missions there and trying to improve our trade links with China. And we have got to work out how to deal with those. North Korea and Iran, obviously we have sanctions against, but we need to do more there. And Tom, just before I finish, I'm going to take up your invitation, because we do have a meeting at 6 o'clock of Conservative Friends of Ukraine. I'm the chairman of Conservative Friends of Ukraine, but as well as Priti Patel and Ian Duncan-Smith speaking at it, we will also have the Ukrainian commander of Operation Interflex, which has been referred to, and also my former colleague, Jack Lepresti, who many of you may know was a Conservative MP, but is now serving in the front line with the Ukrainian army. So I encourage you to come along if you're free at 6 o'clock, and we can continue these discussions.
Plenty of time to continue talking about this kind of thing. I mean, I think it's really important to frame this as something that started not in 2022, in 2014, perhaps even earlier. And Megan, one of the defining features of what's been happening in Ukraine since 2014, and a very harrowing one, is the amount of war crimes that have been committed by Russian forces and directed by the Kremlin. I mean, you have a particular specialism in the forced displacement and abduction of children from Ukraine. Would you be able to talk us through kind of what has happened in this regard and how this fits into Russia's long-term objectives?
Of course. Russia's attack on civilian populations in Ukraine as part of its hybrid warfare is explicitly intentional. It's often framed in the news as byproducts of its invasion. But its attack, particularly on children, the most insidious, is not only intentional but forms a crucial aspect of its long-term war strategy. Of course, many of you will know about the forcible transfer and deportation of Ukrainian children. There's around 20,000 Ukraine cases. Russia itself has said that there's around 750,000 cases, but There's a belief that they intentionally distort the figures so they have an upper hand in peace negotiations. However, what I want to focus on, because of the things my colleagues on the panel have said, is the militarization of children in Russian occupation. I want to touch on the fact I didn't know there was such a small amount of events at conference on Ukraine, and that is particularly concerning. There is 1.6 million children in occupation. From the age of 5, they are undergoing strict re-education programs, forced to hold guns, told they'll soon be doing the brave deeds of their grandfathers, told that NATO is encroaching on their borders. I spoke to one young man who's escaped occupation, who attended school, occupation school in the daytime, and then covertly studied at the Ukrainian school online at great risk to his safety, who told me that the new textbooks and the occupation schools have an obsession with NATO. This is not a case of children having their education changed, and it's certainly in the conversations now, diplomatically, when we're discussing land swaps and what must Ukraine give up in order to end the war. What we're talking about is an area the size of Hungary or Portugal, 1.6 million kids actively being prepared to fight a war with Europe. And that's not an exaggeration. This is in Russian legislation. And Crimea was a testing ground for this. We know that children that have been raised in this education did go on to fight against Ukraine, have since died on the battlefield. Russia was able to do this so swiftly because we ignored them since 2014. We ignored them changing education grounds into pseudo-militarized camps. The Soviet creator of the AK-47, was erected in school grounds in the form of a statue. That happened on more than one occasion. There is a fetishization of old Soviet warfare placed in these children's lives. Not to mention, this is explicitly abusive. Boys at these camps, one of the young men I spoke to, Russian agents at these militarized schools, would pick boys that were particularly good at boxing, and when they got drunk in the evening would make them fight each other and place bets. This is not only abusive, but it is a long-term goal of the Kremlin and Putin. They won't stop at the land they have now, and they do fully inform these children they will be fighting a war with Europe. I will end shortly, but I do want to say we know that children who were occupied from Crimea have died on the battlefield. But what we also know now is that boys in Zaporizhia, for example, have been told to submit their passport documentation for conscription. It will not be long. 1.6 million children being taught to actively fight, told they're actively going to be fighting a war with NATO in the coming years. If you add that to the children in Russia receiving this militarized education since this policy began, we're talking 30 million kids. When they polled British fighting age adults in the UK if they would be willing to go up and fight against Russia, only 29% said yes. That is really scary when you look at those numbers differences. So to have only 2 events on Ukraine, if you consider the one John just mentioned, that is terrifying. You've done half the work, you've come here today, but as the appetite to support this war decreases, do tell people that it is a matter for the UK. This is not charity in Ukraine, it's investment. It's so our brothers don't have to fight, while unfortunately Aliona's does.
Thanks so much, Megan. Could I stay on this topic of war crimes just quickly? President Zelensky said that there are 183,000 cases of war crimes that have happened over the last 3 years. You know, Vladimir Putin's got an arrest warrant out for him from the ICC, as do several other high-profile political and military figures in Russia. But it seems a bit far-fetched that they're actually going to be tried for any of these war crimes, certainly not in The Hague anyway. What measures do you think that the UK and other Western partners can actually impose to really punish them for what they have done in launching an illegal war of aggression?
War crimes, the ICC and sanctions, it's a minefield because you can, of course, think what can be done, what can we actually do. There is a big question of these policies don't just exist at the top at the Kremlin, they go right down. OSINT analysis that we did looking at Telegram channels and VK, which is the Russian version of Facebook, when I was investigating for my last report, this is a policy that goes right down to regular Russians as well. So I would say increase funding for that type of analysis, the type that Yale is doing. Something we found that was in my last report on the militarization and forced transfer of children is there was a forum on the VK platform where Russian parents were talking about adopting Ukrainian children, and they don't have deniability in this. There was conversations happening between prospective mothers where they were saying they would prefer, if they were adopting a Ukrainian child, to adopt one that had been orphaned as a result of the war, because that's much better and that child might be nicer to have in the home than a child traumatized by being orphaned as a result of alcoholic or abusive parents. So they're actively seeking out children that have been orphaned as a result of the war, because not only, as they say, would that be nicer to have in the home, but it does mean that they get better benefits for that as well. They get state-sponsored housing. They get huge bursary packages for this. So what can we do? Sorry, I'll go back to the question. Increase funding for OSINT analysis. USAID did cut, the drawback of USAID did cut back a lot of that for universities, but it's not just America. We don't fund enough. Of course, sanctions, we always say sanctions aren't working, but we're not going far enough. We're not going far enough with countries that are supporting Russia, and there are lots of European companies that indirectly are supplying Russia with telecommunications equipment, for example, that have not been pulled up on that. In Mariupol alone, when Russia occupied that part of Ukraine, 115 cellular towers were erected within a couple of weeks because they wanted to bleed out Ukrainian SIM cards so they could cut off Ukrainians. So we don't go far enough with sanctions. And a few of Putin's allies have mysteriously been falling out of windows lately. And the idea is that the thought is that they are starting to complain to him. They're starting to get bored of this too. They do work on some level. We don't go far enough with them.
Thanks so much, Megan. John, you, of course, sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, so you have quite a lot of work going on about soft power.
Yeah.
And this war is not just about hard power. It also comes into soft power quite a lot. I mean, Russia has really increased its efforts to court and coerce and exploit countries across the global south to shift global alignments in its favour. You know, RT and Sputnik are spreading disinformation about the war, the causes of the war, and the Ukrainian government. What do you think the potential long-term implications of Russia's soft power approach are from this war? And do you think that Britain and the NATO alliance as a whole needs a strategy to deal with Russia's global influence?
Absolutely. Let me first of all just touch on what Megan was saying. There is a huge amount of work being done, and I don't know if people saw the Sunday Times about 2 weeks ago. They named the commanders responsible for Bucha massacre. So, good journalism, and that will bring me on to the second part which you've just asked, but good journalism is identifying these people, and they can be held to account. You're right that the likelihood of our being able to get them out of Russia and put them in The Hague is quite slim. But, the principle which we brought in through Magnitsky sanctions of personally sanctioning individuals responsible for human rights abuses, it does make their life a lot more difficult. It stops them from travelling, it stops them from holding assets in the West, and so that's not to say we shouldn't be doing that. Both sanctioning Russia on an individual level and economic sanctions. But coming to the point you make, you referred to the fact I've been Minister responsible for media for 3 times now in government, and I am very conscious that one of the things the UK is really good at is soft power. And you need soft power to counter the tidal wave of disinformation which is now being spread, particularly by Russia, but also by China. Going back to your first question, authoritarian states are spending an enormous amount, both Russia and China, massively outspend the UK, CGTN and through Sputnik and RT, as you say. The advantage we have is that nobody believes it, or at least a lot of people recognise that it is fabricated on untruth and lies. A lot of it is fake news, it is disinformation that is some now being created through artificial intelligence. Whereas our strength is that generally UK global broadcasts through the World Service are trusted. And that's one of the reasons why, and I was talking to the director of the World Service last night. The World Service is a fantastic asset of this country, and yet it is being cut back. The British Council, another organisation that does a huge amount to promote British influence overseas, is being cut back. And Megan has just referred to the cuts in USAID. As America leaves the field in a lot of these areas, like in Voice of America and support for democracy movements, actually that means we need to step up. Because I don't know how Lincoln will react to this. In my view, when we say that we have an ambition to increase defence expenditure to 3, if not more, % of our GDP, actually we should include within that not just expenditure on frigates and aircraft, but on soft power. Because I think in countering the Russian and the Chinese threat, it is just as important that we respond to the disinformation that is being spread. And the best way we can do that, and it is something which the UK probably is stronger at than any other country in the world, is through things like the BBC World Service. And also other, I've done a lot of work with Iran International, which is based in London. As some of you may know, their journalists were attacked by representatives of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. People choose to come to London because we believe in freedom of speech, we have a free media, and that is something that is a massive advantage to us, and we should be doing far more support.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it's a good time to mention that CGP has been doing some work on this and has released some reports about countering Russia's global influence. And at some point in the next few months, we will be releasing a report specifically on Russian disinformation across the world. So keep an eye out. It will be online. Lincoln, could I come back to you about something that John mentioned earlier about the violations of NATO airspace by Russian assets? We, of course, had drones over an airport in Denmark. A couple of weeks ago, we've had Russian jets penetrating Estonian airspace. They seem to be part of a long line of tests initiated by the Kremlin to see how NATO responds, and if the response isn't suitable enough, then they'll increase in scale and there'll be more provocations down the line. How do you think the UK and NATO should actually respond to these tests from Russia so that it's not emboldened to, escalate these provocations? Do you think it would be reasonable to shoot down Russian jets in our airspace?
Okay, so I want to go back. So to Aliona, I would just say Priti Patel is getting one shot on the main stage to talk about foreign policy tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. And as her PPS, I feel duty-bound to say that you would be reassured to know what's going to be happening there. So do please try and make it to the main hall for that. I think in answering your question about do you shoot down drones and jets, you've got to all conflict is all you've got to ask yourself the question: do you really understand the nature of the conflict that you are in? And you've got to, from the outset, understand that. And I remember reading Alan Brooks' diaries, and in I think it was like June 1943. He was writing in his diary, something's really perplexing me, which is, how do I, once we've invaded Germany and beaten them, how do we beat them in such a way that they can act as a counterbalance to a resurgent Russia in Europe? That's extraordinary. In 1943. Think about where the war was at that time. And I think that, we really need to understand why it is. You used the phrase, Tom, at the beginning of this. Ukraine, to a certain extent, has been fighting this war with a hand tied behind its back. Well, who tied it there? Have we as the West been complicit in, watching and being sufficiently happy that Russia is bleeding away its economy on the razor wire of Donetsk? Is it sort of big, and we're excusing it on the basis that it's a nuclear power and we can't risk tipping them over the edge? 78% of Ukrainians believe, this is a recent RUSI poll, that Ukraine will win this war militarily. And I personally hope that they do. And I hope that we help them in such a way that they can do that and achieve their war aims. Because I think that what the Russians perpetrated was a scandalous invasion of a peaceable country. And I was actually in business, as well as doing 25 years in the army, because I hadn't seen enough violence. I did 10 years in private equity. And in 2014, we had our software developers were in Kyiv. And so I flew over there when the invasion happened, because I thought, well, no one else in the company is going to do it, so I better go. And so I did understand the sort of the plight that they were in at the time. But we need to be sure. We've seen strings. One of the greatest sanctions, in my view, in this war has been the sanctions that we put on Ukraine. We've left their boxing gloves on, and I see we've got a gunner in the audience. Gunners always love giving the advice: punch, don't dribble. And I believe that we've seen the Ukrainians at incredible pace develop drone technology such that there is a kill box now in Russia, which is in Ukraine, which is 900 kilometers deep and about 350 kilometers wide. And if you spark up your armored vehicle, you're acquired within 6 minutes and you are killed within 8. The nature of warfare has changed dramatically. And so move and counter move, you constantly need to develop this. We put strings on Storm Shadow. Elon Musk put strings on Starlink. So what's been the Ukrainian response? They have developed their own missile, which is called Flamingo, and it can fly 4,000 kilometers and hit Moscow. And because it's totally Ukrainian technology, we can't have a say. We can't have a veto. Ironically, the Russians say that it's actually British technology. Well, if the British have got the technology to develop a missile within 9 months that can fly 4,000 kilometers, why haven't we got it in Britain, is all I would say to that. So understand the nature of the conflict that you are in, decide on your strategic aims, and build back to your operational goals. And that way, you pursue the British national interest, you support your allies, and you achieve your aims.
Thank you, Lincoln. I think punch, don't dribble is good advice that we can all take back with us. Aliona, this is probably one of the most important questions that we've had in recent months over the future security of Ukraine. President Trump appeared to rule out NATO membership for Ukraine, and there's been talk about the coalition of the willing, and it seems a bit uncertain how that will go ahead, even if it does, go ahead. In the absence of NATO membership, what should security guarantees for Ukraine look like? And how can we ensure that any commitment to Ukraine under an Article 5-like guarantee is actually upheld by European powers and also backed by the US as well?
That's a good question, Tom. I think it's something that the 32 countries of the Coalition of the Willing are still trying to figure out, and I have about 3 minutes to try to provide all the answers. But to be honest, from all the coalitions that ever existed on Ukraine within the last 3 years, and there have been plenty, I think this one is so far the most dubious one. No matter how many people I speak to, be it in British MOD or in France, where the current headquarters for the Coalition of the Willing is, for 1 year, for some reason, and then it's going to move to London to hold the leadership here. I think it's still being decided on what exactly this coalition will be able to provide to Ukraine. For now, the only thing that's been clear enough is that there will be no boots on the ground unless there's a ceasefire, and there will be no boots on the ground on the front line. So effectively, this strategy of self-deterrence and reassuring the enemy continues. as effectively as it can. So it's all a little bit unclear, not to say completely useless at the moment. In terms of security guarantees, I think Ukraine is quite clear that NATO membership is not on the agenda, not with American administration in place. I know that at the last summit that was held, it was quite difficult to even get Ukraine into the summit and to get Zelensky to participate in several sideline discussions, not to mention the main events. They did keep some resolution that Ukraine will eventually become the member of NATO. But the security guarantees for Ukraine, of course, will depend on the nature of the ceasefire, if not peace, because I think we can all agree at least on one thing, that peace is still very far away. In Ukraine, the ceasefire and how effective it will be and who will be the guarantors of this ceasefire is crucial. If it's going to be United States, then maybe Russia will be taking it seriously. For now, they're not taking Europe itself too seriously, unfortunately, especially with the reaction to drone incursions and fighter jet incursions, because they can see that they basically can get away with anything. Securing the sky over Ukraine, I think, will be the most important thing for civilians. There's an initiative called Sky Shield that's being actively advocated for in Ukraine and abroad, of doing 3 zones of air defense for Ukraine, starting with first the Western European countries on the border of Ukraine, then going into Zone 1 in the west of Ukraine, then spreading out further to the center, but not further away than the river Dnipro, which kind of separates Ukraine into the left bank and right bank Ukraine. But of course, we don't know where the demarcation line with Russia will be. How many regions will they want to keep if there's a ceasefire to take? As we've seen some allegations that they even wanted to take land that they still do not hold. There were also reports that Witkoff went to Moscow and signed off Odessa just like that, kind of prohibiting Ukraine from access to the Black Sea, that it worked so hard, again with its ingenuity with maritime drones, to secure and push Russia away. So unfortunately, I don't have a very concrete answer for you, Tom, because it's all up in the air. All I know is the air defense will be crucial, and then the presence of some troops will be very important for Ukraine. But then how Russia will treat those troops and whether it will decide to use it as a pretext to actually start war with Europe later, I think it would all depend on the conditions that all the parties will settle on. But for now, I don't see any ceasefire in sight, unfortunately.
Lincoln, you want to come in on this issue?
I do. I just want to put whatever the security guarantee, and I completely agree with Aliona, until we know what the settlement is, then we can't know what the security guarantee needs to be. But I do want to put it in context. With the Defence Committee, we went to Estonia and Finland in February this year. And I can tell you that the great fear there is that the real concern is that if you put boots on the ground in Ukraine in order to police whatever it is, there are potentially 750,000 battle-hardened Russian soldiers who you then refurbish and you then send off to Finland, or you send off to Estonia, or you threaten various other places. And so, and of course there already is a security guarantee within enlarged NATO and an additional 1,400 kilometres of border in Finland. And so that's the context in which this question needs to be answered, because if President Putin thinks that he's had some form of success in Ukraine, there's every reason to believe that he will go again, and we really will be at it. And so I would just add that additional context.
I'm now going to open it up to the floor for questions. So got quite a few here already. Please do say your name and where you're from, and try and keep the questions short and snappy. We don't want any long statements because there's quite a few people who want to ask questions. So we'll start right at the front over here. I'll take two at a time, and then the gentleman over on the right.
Hi, my name is Maria Romanenko. I'm a journalist who's likely on the Russian kill list, and I know this because two of my friends have been killed whilst reporting on occupied areas of Ukraine. It appears very clear to me that unless Europe steps up, which it appears to be both unwilling and unlikely to do, there will be further Russian incursions and invasions in Europe. Who, in your opinion, will be the first major Western European country to move into a war economy and to stop pretending like their citizens aren't effectively already at war?
Thank you. And then the gentleman just over here.
Thank you. Name's Ian Bocking from Gosport. Question really for Aliona. Is there any possibility whatsoever that you could trust any agreement that Vladimir Putin would enter into with you?
Thank you very much. Lincoln, do you want to go for the first one about moving into a war economy, given you're on the Defence Select Committee?
Yeah, and it comes back to something John said earlier about will the BBC World Service be counted towards the 5% that we claim to be spending or going to be spending on. We miraculously came up with another 1.5% just before the NATO summit. So don't worry, everything will be hypothecated against that because it's a bucket of nothing. It's 50% smoke, 50% mirrors. I think that the answer to your question is that you get a very different sense from the European nations who border Russia. And, you know, that they are very much more on a war footing. I think Finland has a population of 5 million, and they can put 4.5 million of them underground. And they can put 200,000 troops in the field. You know, I used to be in a professional army. We can put 72,000 theoretically, notionally probably about, you know, far fewer than that. And I do think, and I'm sure we'll come on to it with your questions, but we all need to wake up to the fact that, you know, this is a pre-war era. And it doesn't need to be smoke and it doesn't need to be mirrors. It needs to be wholesale reform of our attitudes. So we love the fact that we sent loads of drones to Ukraine. But the fact is that 80% of them never came back from their first mission because things had moved on, and what we thought was state of the art was not. And so everyone needs to take it a great deal more seriously, take it seriously, get a grip, and seriously move our own population forward, and you know, move that 29% of people under 30 who would fight for their country to a figure far greater than that.
Aliona, the question from the gentleman, can you trust Putin at all?
I'll just quickly reassure Maria that hopefully our lives are in our own hands, and hopefully God's too. I was put on the kill list of Russians in 2014 as well. I was announced persona non grata and then kill list of separatists back then. And yet here we still are, doing as much as we can. In terms of whether we can take Putin seriously, no, but whether he can comply with the conditions if we will be firm enough with him, absolutely. One wrong kind of preconceived notion that the West does get guilty of repeating over and over again is thinking that Putin is very mighty and powerful and unbeatable. And that's, I think, the one thing that kept us from actually being effective in Ukraine and then here in the West deterring Russia through, you know, disinformation, cyber attacks, or anything else that they've been doing. If we put enough mechanisms to coerce Putin into ceasefire, if not peace, it can be done. But we've said this many times, and I'm not the author of this phrase, but it's factually true, that Putin only understands power, and so far we have not projected it one bit. We self-deterred with nuclear scares. We were scared of Russia as a concept, as a mighty nation, no matter how much they proved to us over and over again that their army was incapable of doing anything until they paired up with China and Iran. And even now, there are mechanisms. There are secondary sanctions. They're putting more sanctions on all of the Russian banks because not all of them are actually sanctioned. There are secondary sanctions on oil and gas industry. We need the price for oil per barrel, which is unrealistic, but if it goes down to $35 per barrel, Russia is done. And it's unrealistic. But who's doing that for us? Ukraine, with, as Lincoln mentioned, Flamingo missiles. Earlier this year, I was privileged enough to go see other jet drones that are unfortunately called beavers, but that's the name that Ukrainians chose, but they fly over 1,000 kilometers and drop over 30 tons of explosives on Russian refineries. And if they continue with that, they will be able to cripple that system and effectively leave Russia naked and unable to fight this war, even with all the support from China and Iran. Not to mention American tomahawks that, again, were dangled in front of Ukraine and then pulled back immediately. So there are mechanisms. If there's a will, there's a way. But we need to find the will. We need to find, pardon my expression, our chutzpahs collectively and just get on with it.
Questions? The gentleman just here on the right in the aisle. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Baines from Halifax in West Yorkshire. My question is that I believe that the UK actually have frozen a lot of funds from Russian funds. Why don't we release that to pay for that and help the Ukraine and reduce it and send it back to them?
Yeah. Thank you. There's also the Chelsea FC fund, which still is just there from when Roman Abramovich had to sell Chelsea Football Club. The gentleman just here.
Thank you. Tom Palmer-Goldie from Cambridge. Was the current government correct to prevent the designation of China as an enemy state for the purposes of the Chinese spy trials this weekend?
Great. Short and snappy. Like it. Megan, do you want to come in on the first one about frozen funds and frozen assets?
I don't know why we don't just hand them over. It makes sense. Emmanuel Macron seems to think like we will be able to do it. Interestingly, I've always believed, I'll say this because we're at a Conservative Party conference, I always believed the Labour Party were going to do it. At the Yes conference, which was in Kyiv 2 years ago, I think now, a Labour politician sat on the panel and said, don't worry, this is in our manifesto, we're going to do it within 6 months. It wasn't done. So when it wasn't done, I assumed there was a reason for this. I'll have to hand over to someone else on the panel. I'm not a sanctions expert. But yeah, there's some reason it keeps crippling, and I don't know why. I don't know why we can't move around it.
I do want to jump in. For someone quite so hawkish, I'm a bit queasy about this one, surprisingly. Because to my mind, this is about as, in terms of soft power, this is about as nuclear a bomb as you can do, taking money out of people's bank accounts. And so I can quite see why, both governments, the last lot and this lot, are hiding behind the legalities of it, because it is a major move that if you, start taking money out of people's bank accounts, I think that is as powerful a message as a nuclear bomb in terms of the world order.
Mind if I
Yeah, sure.
do you think, my question to you, do you think then we need to perhaps bring something into legislation as a way to get off the sanctions list? If we're not going to keep the money, there is actually no legal mechanism or even classification of why, say, a Russian, a friendly Russian living in London, I might say, well, tell me how to get off.
I come back to my question about understanding the nature of the war that you're fighting. It could well be... A mate of mine was Roman Abramovich's personal bodyguard. He said, I have an absurd job, because for as long as I'm on, as long as my boss is on the right side of Putin, no one's ever going to attack him, so I'm not needed. And as soon as he's on the naughty step, then there could be 500 of me, and they still wouldn't stop him. And so I don't know. I'm not privy to the intelligence. I don't know whether we want to, whether the succession planning is there in order that we want to remove Putin, or whether it's better to have him hold, economically. I don't know what the strategy is for dealing with Putin. But I do know that if we start taking the money, that is going to send shockwaves around his entourage and his vested interests. And I just, I would hesitate to be too definitive, because I am hoping that someone is playing a bigger game, and that is why the constraint is there.
John.
First of all, to say we're already doing it. As you may have seen, a lot of the aid that is being supplied to Ukraine now is funded by the interest payments on frozen Russian assets. Now, that is not the assets themselves. They are sitting in bank accounts, they are accumulating interest, and we are taking the interest and using it to support Ukraine. And you can argue that actually, if you take the interest, essentially that is taking money which otherwise would be legally owned by Russia. So the principle of using Russian assets has already started. Now, I'm more hawkish than Lincoln. I think we do need to start looking at actually taking the assets themselves. But you then need to consider what you mean. There are three types of Russian assets, and there are arguments in each case. The first is the central bank reserves, which are held mainly in Belgium, but amount to a huge amount, and I think there is a case for examining whether or not we can use those. There is then the assets of the Russian state, it's companies, Gazprom, Rosneft, all of these, they are clearly state assets, and we can look at potentially using those. And then more difficult are the assets held by individuals, oligarchs. But we do know that no oligarch possesses money without the permission of Putin. In large part, it is Putin's money that they are holding. And the idea that the assets which we have frozen are ever going to be returned to Russia, unless there is a drastic change in the Russian government, it seems to me very unlikely. It is legally complex. I've spent a lot of time talking to lawyers about this, but there is legal precedent for doing it. We used the assets frozen after the Gulf War to rebuild Kuwait. The problem is that in that case we defeated the government. I'd love to think we're going to defeat Russia and change the government, but that seems to be something that's not going to happen in the short term. But personally, as has already been said, there's a bill before the Canadian Parliament for the seizure of assets. I think that it can be done. I think it can be legally justified, and personally, I think we should do it.
Can I just ask you to remember where you were the day that Sir John Whittingdale was more hawkish than Lincoln John?
John, can we stick with you with this current approach to China? I mean,
yes.
I'm reminded of Peter Navarro, one of Trump's advisors, who called the UK a compliant servant of the Chinese Communist Party. Are we being far too soft?
As I referred at the start, I think we are schizophrenic. On the particular case which was referred to of the espionage attempts in the UK Parliament, two Select Committee chairmen have written expressing real concern as to why that prosecution was dropped, and I think there are serious questions that need to be answered. But the wider question, we have China that we know is active in espionage, in disinformation, and is counter to our interests. And that's before you even get on to issues like Hong Kong and the imprisonment of Jimmy Lai and the abandonment of the law that was agreed, and the treatment of the Uyghurs and the treatment of the Tibet. On so many areas, we are hostile to China, and China is opposed to everything that we believe in. But at the same time, China is going to be the biggest economy in the world. And so we want to make trade with them. I was a Secretary of State at the time of what was called the golden era of UK-Chinese relations. I met Xi Jinping. I took him with David Cameron to look at Manchester City Football Club because China had decided that they wanted to play football. That is in the past, but we still on the one hand, are saying China is our enemy, and at the same time saying we want to increase trade. I think they should be on the enhanced register, personally, and there's a lot of pressure to do so. But I think the government has got to make up its mind whether or not China is a country that we can do business with.
It seems like the problem is that China isn't being classed as an enemy, and that's why that case fell through. We'll take two more questions. The gentleman sitting down and all men, and the gentleman standing up at the back as well.
Thank you. Tony Johnson, Cheadle constituency. I visited Ukraine in 1990, and it was clear that there were future problems that are going to arise. And what was sad was the decline in our defence capabilities. I would just, say that we've noticed the Russian hostility and subversion, and I just wondered to what extent that Britain is actually reciprocating by actually trying to support opposition to Putin. I'd also just like to ask why we don't actually take on China in relation to the trade deficit, like Trump is in relation to many countries around the world, and clearly the deficit which they have with us is merely helping to finance the recolonization of so many countries in Africa.
Great, thank you. And then the gentleman just standing there.
Thank you. Greg Stevens, party member from South East London, but the context of this is served in the Royal Marines and also worked for a major defence contractor. So some of the panel mentioned how there have been few events about Ukraine at this conference. I've noticed there's very few events about defence in totality at this conference. And I've also been to a few of the panel events where people have talked about polling and the concerns of the public and what's the path back to power for the Conservative Party or the right. And these pollings and questions don't mention defence. So either they're not asking the question or it just isn't a concern of the public. So with all that in mind, my two questions really for the panel would be, how do political leaders in particular shape opinion to make the public aware of the danger we may be in? And more particularly to defence, and this is definitely a lesson from our Ukrainian friends, is how do we invest in expanded defence industrial capacity, particularly at a SME level, in order to innovate and have freedom of modification, freedom of action? Thank you.
Could I just ask that you excuse me? I've got to go and see the Czech ambassador at 5 o'clock, and I don't want to keep him waiting. So I'll leave my colleagues on the panel to field the rest of the questions.
Talk about the far right.
I would encourage you to come along at 6 o'clock for the Conservative Friends of Ukraine meeting. It's in the Petersfield Suite in the Midland.
Thank you.
Well, let's give John a round of applause as he leaves anyway. Okay, we're running out of time very quickly, so just some quick points from our panel. To what extent is Britain reciprocating against Putin? Does anyone want to go on that one?
Not enough. I would argue we're already at war with Russia. NHS blood, all our blood became void. I got a letter through my door saying, you have a rare blood type, please, we'll accept you any time this week, just please come and donate blood. It was shut down by Russia, and it was all over the news. The NHS was attacked. The British Library still has no working computer system. We are already at war with Russia. We are not doing enough. We don't do enough on disinformation. And to a similar point earlier about our policy being schizophrenic, it is schizophrenic. We talk, never is the word disinformation used so much, and yet we are doing absolutely nothing about it. There's a former British MP who was sharing that picture that was very clearly AI, and it made me think, he must know it's AI, but is so supportive of the Kremlin that it's just pushing out of former British special forces that were caught in Ukraine, fighting for Ukraine. So we're doing nothing on disinformation. We even have some of our own peddling it. We're doing nothing on education when it comes to what warfare means. We're doing nothing when it comes to actually our I would agree. Did you say about soft power earlier? It's our greatest weapon. It's what we've done best. It's enshrined in our history, and we're doing nothing there. We're losing huge parts of the world stuck in our kind of European cohort, which is amazing. But as Aliona mentioned, through the coalition of the willing, it's not enough. It's just not enough. So I'll hand over to a colleague.
Lincoln, how do political leaders shape opinion on defence, particularly in this era, what you just described as a pre-war era?
Yeah. So a couple of points. There are 26 new Tory MPs from the last cohort. I'm eternally grateful to the mother of John Cooper, the MP for Dumfries and Galloway, because as a result of her being giving birth to John 4 months before me, I am not the oldest of the 26. But of the 26, there is Neil Shastri-Hurst, Ben Obsejekti, David Reid, and I, who are all ex-military. And actually, all the parties had a vast number more veterans at the last election standing as candidates. I think Labour got 11 out of 17 that they were fielding. And our friends in the Liberal Democrats also have a number of veterans in their number. And obviously, the Ulster parties have a number too. I do think we need to be more part of the conversation. I did, however, sit up on... I was selected 4 days into the general election as the candidate for Spelthorne. And I sat up on about day 10, bolt upright in my bed as I turned on my radio at 6 a.m. to start getting ready to go campaigning, and they said the Conservatives are going to reintroduce conscription. And I sat bolt upright and said, we're going to do what? And but I do think that there is a growing sense that national resilience needs to be part of the national conversation. You're actually seeing it in some of the softer end of things in terms of our young people at school and developing more grit. On your point about the defence industrial base, in my view, it needs reaming out. With our 18 primes and how many, 18 prime contractors, they are not doing enough, nearly enough, for our SMEs in the UK. And maybe Putin's right. Maybe Flamingo was developed on the back of UK missile technology. And the irony is that we have loads of SMEs in this country who are exporting to loads of other countries and not our own defence capability. And so the National Armaments Director, who we're going to pay 600 grand a year, and for that money, I asked the Defence Procurement Minister then, Eagle, I don't want to have whoever is the National Armaments Director come to us in a year's time and say, I really wanted to change things, but I wasn't allowed to. And she reassured me not only is he being given carte blanche, he or she being given carte blanche to tear up the book, but we will hold them account for doing so. So let's hold them to account for that statement.
And final remarks, Aliona.
Just very quickly, 3 points that I just can't stay quiet on frozen Russian assets. So I will very quickly say that there are 200 billion euros worth of Russian assets in Europe. But I think what we should do in the UK is stop pointing fingers to them, because that's the biggest chunk. We have 26 billion pounds worth of Russian assets in the UK. And I would also be way more hawkish and for the nuclear option, because I still remember the day 1 week before the invasion, there was a discussion where people were arguing whether SWIFT and shutting off SWIFT to Russia would be a nuclear option or not, and they said absolutely yes. The invasion happened and the SWIFT went along with the Russian invasion. So I do believe that the assets should be seized. 26 billion of it. Unfortunately, as Megan mentioned, Sir Chris Bryan, backbencher from Labour Party, has put in a bill on seizing Russian assets. It was blocked in the second reading by the front bench, so government is not ready yet to seize the assets, but they could follow the European model where Merz, for example, from Germany is absolutely for seizing the assets. France is a bit more reluctant and wants to hang on to those, so they're now using it as a collateral to get loans to Ukraine and then pay it off and return it once the full amount of reparation is paid to Ukraine by Russia. So the mechanism and the precedent is about to be established in Europe. They're very close. So the UK should also get on top of its 26 billions. In terms of UK's capabilities of countering and pushing Russia back, There is actually a very strong and effective, or at least it used to be, disinformation unit in FCDO, and I was lucky enough to work with them several times. Unfortunately, one of the experts and driving forces behind it is just about to resign from theirs, but I do hope it will stay in good hands. They were there countering disinformation across Europe and giving very good advice in countering Russia in all the narratives, and looking at countries like Slovakia and now Czechia, unfortunately too, going with the pro-Russian coalition. So there is expertise there definitely, and as far as I know, the UK is very good at counter attacks in cyberspace on Russia. So that gives me a lot of reassurance. Again, if there's a will, there's a way, and expertise is here. And finally, on defense SMEs, there is one defense event tomorrow. That's
two defense events tomorrow.
Sorry, I'm kind of spoiling it, but yeah, Tom and I are definitely going to be together at one of them. There is a cooperation between UK and Ukraine, and again, we tried to put it, when I worked with FCDO on the 100-year partnership agreement between the two countries, we've put into the agreement the creation of drone hub, so that it won't be limited just to drones, but it would create a framework and a mechanism for the UK to get all the experience from Ukraine's battlefield. There is a white paper that's just been produced by colleagues over there on how to get SMEs up and running and more agile in this very quick turnaround of defense. So I feel like United Kingdom is on the right track. It's doing all the right things, a little bit slower than we would all like, but at least the direction is right.
I'm afraid we've run over time. Sorry for keeping you from your gin and tonics. Luckily, John is hosting an event where there will surely be some for you to acquire. CGP will be back tomorrow with 5 panels throughout the day, so please do come along. It would be great to see you all there. But for the time being, please can you join me in giving a big round of applause to our panelists today.